1970s, that is. 19, not 1870s. Okay? And he said to me, he is said to be the greatest communicator in the English Reformed world. And I remember thinking, this I must see. And I think in 1984, it was either 1984 or 1985, I was speaking at the Pensacola Theological Institute, which those who are over 65 will remember from the dim and distant past. And RC was one of the speakers. They had to hire somewhere else to get an auditorium big enough for the number of people who wanted to come. And I still remember my first conversation with him. I remember being, many things say, being drawn into friendship by him.
And those parents out there, just you don't know, your teenage kids are not going to come and tell you, I'm heading off to college. I just want you to know how much you've anchored me in the truth. They're not going to say that. They're going to be on their phone when you're crying and they go off to school and what? You know. Are you crying, Mom? But things stick with you, and things that you just saw, habits in your parents and in your church, are hard to shake off. And I by God's grace, just knew I should not shake that off. And
legalism, a stranglehold on the external with no real change in the heart, superficial gospel. I think a low view of God. I think. You know, without being heavy-handed, I think if you have a balanced presentation of the attributes of God and the glory of Christ, somebody might walk away from it, but they would have a harder time becoming a public critic of it, because they would be attacking the majesty and the beauty and the glory and the full understanding of God. So I think one of the reasons in the years I've been here, 40 plus years, 25 of those years we've been going through one of the four Gospels. And it's Christ every week, Christ every week, Christ every week, every week. And if you're going to walk away and you're going to condemn this church, you're going to condemn the glory of Christ that dominates this church. That's a little harder to do than to condemn all the people sitting in the pews.
Sufficiently covered. Alistair, what are some of the primary reasons you might see for the lack of holiness in our contemporary society? And I suppose you could say are within the church and outside of the church.
Well, outside of the church, I think we'd have to say that if the yeast of the church is going to work through a culture and through a community in a life-changing way, then the church somehow owes a piece of the circumstances there, inasmuch as if you take, for example, the law of God that is given to the people of God in order that they might be seen to be absolutely distinct within the culture in which they're set, then any abuse of God's law in terms of the moral activity and the lifestyle of the people of God has some kind of impact on the society. So for example, if you take, and I don't want to start the debate, but if you take the issue of the Lord's Day and you leave it where it sits as the fourth commandment, and you go back even 30 years in America, I think it would be possible to at least argue the case that there is some correlation between the different perspective of the people of God in relationship to the nature of the Lord's Day and the overspill of that into the community. For example, the Open Golf Championship, which Americans refer to as the British Open, but the Open Golf Championship never was concluded on a Sunday, right up until the 1960s. In Scotland, it wasn't by law that shops were closed on Sundays when I was still in my teens. It was as a result of what somebody has referred to as the law of the unenforceable. And that is that it would just seemed it was an impropriety. It just wasn't right. And I think that had something to do, and still up in the Western Isles of Scotland, has something to do with the impact of the people of God infiltrating a community and a culture. And I'm just rambling now, but I think that as I've been here these last 18 years, one of the things that has struck me is how much emphasis has been placed on trying to make an impact on America, as it were, politically and structurally from the top down. And yet at the same time, we've been rather poor in making an impact culturally, and in the realm of the media, and in the realm of the arts, and in the interface of solid believing people who have been able to have an impact there. When you come to the issue of the church and the absence of holiness, one of the great problems, I think, is the absence of the preaching of the Bible, the teaching of the Bible, which establishes then who God is and the nature of God. And Tozer, in his The Knowledge of the Holy, he speaks about how no church is going to ever be able to rise any higher than its awareness of who God is in all of his glory and in his majesty.